Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Eisenberg, and I am Programming and Outreach Graduate Assistant here at Falvey Memorial Library. On behalf of Joe Lucia, our Library Director, and the entire staff here at Falvey, welcome to the final lecture in our Spring 2012 Scholarship at Villanova series. However, as we finish up this last week of programs in this spring semester, we also look forward to our Falvey Scholars Award this Friday morning, where we'll honor 5 senior students for their research and get to hear their presentations. Of course, we invite everyone to that event as well, and more information on this week's final events for the semester can be found on our library's website. For today's lecture, we welcome Dr. Michael Tomko, Associate Professor of Literature in the Department of Humanities. Dr. Tomko holds a PhD in English Literature from the University of Notre Dame, a Master's in Philosophy in British Romantic Studies from Oxford University, and a BA from Swarthmore College. His research focuses on British Romanticism and English Catholic culture and history. Here on campus, he teaches courses such as the Late Romantics, English Catholic Literature, Religion and the Literary Experience, and others. Today, he joins us to discuss his book, British Romanticism and the Catholic Question: Religion, History, and National Identity, 1778 to 1829. Dr. Tomko's work examines one of the Romantic period's most controversial issues, Catholic emancipation, and describes how this period in history not only caused political and cultural conflicts, but also provoked some of the most exceptional writings of the time. Please help me welcome Dr. Tomko.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank everyone from the library for hosting this event. I'd like to thank Jeff for the introduction and Regina for getting things together, and Alexandra, I don't know if she's here today, for writing up the piece about it. I have stolen a title from the article previewing this talk that was on the website, High Historical Drama, and then the title of the book, British Romanticism and the Catholic Question. And I was reading her piece, and I thought, high historical drama, that really nails it. And then I had to say, who said that? And then I looked in the article, and it was me, right? To paraphrase Winnie the Pooh, that is me. So in the way I think it captures what I'm doing in the book, and this is very much going to be an informal presentation of the material, the arguments in the book. I figure if you want the dry, formal variety, you can buy the book at the bottom, you know, the basement price, the super sale price at which it's offered, and get the full version. But so this is going to be an informal outline of some of the main ideas, and then at the end, as I'll share with you in a second, I'll be focusing in on a specific piece from the Wordsworth chapter. So we'll zoom out to take the whole thing in, and then zoom in on Wordsworth at the end. So thank you all for being here. It's good to see students, former students, colleagues here, and I appreciate your time, and I hope to use it well. So high historical drama, why is that an appropriate title? And I think it's because one of the chief things that this book does, and that I aim to do in this book, is to combine the literary or the artistic, i.e. drama, with those things that we normally consider the realm of history, politics, historical change, and bring them two together in a way that I think is true to the period, the events of the period, and to the literature of the Romantic period. And accounts of British Romanticism have often striven to separate the two. And my work falls within a kind of branch of criticism that's looking to unite the two in hopefully fruitful and insightful ways that will improve our understanding of both areas, both the historical and the literary. Okay? And I thought I would also start with, so that's one main combination that's going on. I'm going to be talking about paradoxes and contradictions a little bit later. Let's talk about integrations now. And history and drama, that's one integration. The other is this illustration, which I took from within the book. These are the ruins of Bury St. Edmund's Abbey in England, which is where one of the authors was from, Elizabeth Inchbald, who was an English Catholic herself and a novelist. And these are the ruins that were in her backyard, more or less. Interestingly, though, for the purposes of illustration, the writers of this book, it's a local history, had to excerpt the ruins. Right? So this isn't actually what it looked like. These ruins aren't actually what it looked like. The town of Bury St. Edmunds got built into the ruins. So we have here the ruins of a medieval Catholic past in England, right? And this change from being a full cathedral, a full abbey, excuse me, an abbey, happened at the Reformation. But they didn't go away, and they didn't just belong to the past, but rather this past was built into English society and culture as it developed, as you can see in the illustration of what it actually looked like, right? The town walls are taken from the abbey. So the houses, the walls, the identity of the city is interwoven with this medieval Catholic past, something that seemed to be lost to history, but was still influencing, shaping, and defining the present into the 18th century and into today. It looks largely like this if you go today. Okay, so high historical drama, British Romanticism and the Catholic question. So what I hope to do today, just to outline the talk, is to hit on three main elements, three main points. The first is just to outline the elements of the argument, and that will consist of simply defining, for those who don't think about Blake at night, and I do, and it's frightening, what British Romanticism is, basically. And some of you probably are more familiar with that than the other term in the book, what the Catholic question is. So I want to define both of those and then talk about what happens when they run into each other, right? And that, instead of the integration that we saw a minute ago, will produce the contradictions. And this book is about the contradictions when those two elements meet. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the elements of the argument. I'll give you a very brief overview of the contents of the book, and then, like I said, I want to put it into action by looking at a piece from Wordsworth. So what is British Romanticism? First, we have a picture from Caspar David Friedrich, who's not British, but this is a picture that's often used as an icon. I've talked about it before, that indicates and captures the spirit of British Romanticism. And there's a sense that the Romantic era was a unified moment in which a kind of spiritual energy produced an awakening across different realms of society. Okay, so there's this sense of there being a special spirit of the age, or a special spirit belonging to the age. Some of the characteristics of that spirit is an elevation of the individual's imagination. Right? So we have here, in this picture, no one else. Right? We have one man raised above the rest. There's not even any elements or pictures of society there. And we can't help but think of, what is that man thinking? Right? We're drawn to what is going on inside that gentleman's head as he looks out into nature. Right? So there's this emphasis on the individual's imagination. On the other hand, the flip side of this is it's not simply an encounter with the subjective, but it has an exploration of the objective, of nature. So it's interested in what nature is, and when it approaches nature, the phrase that's often used to describe that approach is that it approaches nature supernaturally, or takes part in what's often called natural supernaturalism. So it has this mystical view of nature, not necessarily a religious view, but a mystical view towards nature. And again, it's suggested by the very mists, the kind of mysterious mists in this picture by Friedrich. if you want to talk about what is at the heart of the spirit of the age, and if you're taking a multiple choice test and the French Revolution is one of the options, you should mark the French Revolution as your answer. Right? The French Revolution defined and influenced British Romanticism, this moment of global crisis and hope and crisis, right, in which it seemed like a new democratic era was dawning. But then a few years later, that revolution, that democratic revolution, was caught up in chaos and violence. So the highs and lows of the French Revolution shape British Romanticism. Now, even as it's shaping British Romanticism, it's often seen, Romanticism is often seen as transcending or trying to get away from that chaos. Right? We have somebody here who has stepped out of society, stepped above society, stepped away from society. So in some ways, we're drawn to think sometimes, perhaps, that what is going on in his mind is bigger, is better than, is not involved with those political machinations that happen at the French Revolution or in any other political event. Okay, so if Paradise Lost isn't one of the answers on the multiple choice question, or if French Revolution isn't one of the answers on the on the multiple, so if the French Revolution isn't an answer on the multiple choice question, but Paradise Lost is, then you mark Paradise Lost, right? Paradise Lost is a key text for the Romantics, and they do a lot with it. So much of the Romantic imagination is mediated through Milton. Now, if Paradise Lost and the French Revolution are both on the multiple choice question, I cannot help you, right? You'll have to do your best. Now, how does Paradise Lost, which is a retelling of the book of Genesis, show up in British Romanticism? It's complicated, but it's often taken, and it's often been argued, that it takes what Milton gave us, the grandeur, the devotion, the energy, even the revolution that Milton gave us, takes that Protestantism and converts it into something that's secular or pseudo-secular. It's still kind of got a sense of mystery about it, but it is taking the next step in the development of Protestantism. And there's a narrative, there's a historical narrative of religion, that you first had Catholicism, then there was an advance forward to Protestantism, which was more rational and more respectful of the individual, and that Romanticism and the Enlightenment were then taking the next step. Okay? So this sense of the spirit of age being a march of progress in religious terms as well. Okay, so that's I could talk for ages about nuances within each of those, but that's a very basic bullet point sketch of the first element within the book's title. Who is British Romanticism? On the one hand, British Romanticism has traditionally been associated with 6 big poets, 6 great poets. That's a picture of Coleridge there, William Wordsworth, who we'll be talking about, Blake, who's on the nice poster that the library drew up. This is Percy Bysshe Shelley in memoriam, and then Byron and Keats. And all of these figures were in some ways involved with the Catholic question, involved in Catholic emancipation, and figure in the book. On the other hand, recent years have expanded the scope of what counts as British Romanticism, and we have people who are not writing poetry, but writing novels, writing drama, and we also have figures, women, people from what is often called the Celtic fringe, from Scotland and Ireland, who are writing as well. And those figures feature importantly in the book as well, and these are some of the ones that find a place in the book. Walter Scott, Sidney Owenson, who's pictured there, who's an Irish writer, Felicia Hemans, who's an English poet, Robert Southey, who's a friend with the Big Six, and Elizabeth Inchbald, who's an English Catholic novelist. So that's the who. What happens when those two elements meet the Catholic question? Well, to talk about that, we have to first have an understanding of what the Catholic question is. In the book, and today, I'll be invariably using the Catholic question, which refers to a broad set of issues, almost interchangeably with Catholic emancipation, which refers to a specific bill involved in the Catholic question that was meant to address some of the problems. But here's an outline of the problem, and this again is a thumbnail sketch. So after the Reformation in England, the argument goes that in order to make sense of Britain, make sense of what it meant to be British, first English and then British, you had to construct a national identity. Right? There was a kind of period of chaos following the Reformation, and England was defining itself as something new as it broke away from the Roman Catholic Church and changed its ties to continental Europe. So what would this new England look like? And the argument was, several historians have made this argument, is that one of the ways that Britain came to understand itself was in opposition to a Catholic other. Right? This was a Protestant nation, and what that meant was all the things that Catholicism wasn't. Okay? So Catholicism was seen as tyrannical and productive of groupthink. It was seen as backwards, as primitive, and superstitious. Okay? So particularly in France, right, which, you know, there's some other issues going on there, but France and Spain. And as England grew to compete in the world market with France and Spain, there was this narrative of this is how we do things, that is how they do things. To understand ourselves, we have to kind of think against them. Now, this us versus them mentality, however, becomes more complicated because there were Catholics within England. Right? There were some of us who are religiously affiliated with them. In England, this was less so. The presence of Catholicism dwindled to a minority, and it was largely because of what were called the Penal Laws. These were a series of laws meant to make the practice of Catholicism impracticable. Double taxation, laws against inheriting property, death penalty or exportation for priests who are on the English soil. Right? There's a series of these, and there was a series of martyrs that grew out of these penal laws. And they were largely effective in England. Right? There was a remnant of Catholics in the Lancaster area. There were pockets of them in London, and there were pockets of them spread throughout the country around and under the protection of the English Catholic gentry. However, the story of Catholicism in England is a story of defeat. And great English Catholics from later on, Tolkien, I was just talking about Tolkien in my previous class, Pugin, they had a sense of woundedness when they looked to their own history. Now, in Ireland, and this is a twofold story, although I concentrate mainly on England, in Ireland it produced the opposite effect. Instead of a dwindling minority, it produced an angry minority, like a resolute, persecuted minority who, through the abuses associated with the penal laws, grew to hate the political arrangement with England more and more and more. Okay? So this is what we're left with in around 1780 when this debate about getting rid of the penal laws, emancipating Catholics from the penal laws, really begins. Okay? And this will lead us to the first of our paradoxes. Catholic emancipation, or relief or getting rid of the penal laws that enforce the minority status of English Catholics, seems like a no-brainer. On the one hand, you had Irish Catholics who were really angry about it, and there were lots of them, right? And they were feared. And instead of having the Irish Catholics against you, it would have made and this is how the argument went, it would have made much more sense to have them on our side. Hey, if we emancipate them, they could fight in our armies against the French and the Spanish, right? We could be sending them to the Americas. We'd be better off, right? Instead of having them fighting us, they could fight for us. So it would make sense to get rid of the penal laws. And there wouldn't seem to be a downside. English Catholics were no longer a threat. Bonnie Prince Charlie, that had all happened, that had gone, right? And the Catholic bishop of London summarized the state of English Catholicism in this way. When he talks about the old religion, he's talking about Catholicism. The things of this world all seem to stand against the old religion in this nation. The general prejudice of the people, the penal laws, the authority of the magistrate, the interest of the clergy, the eloquence of the pulpit, the learning of the universities, the favor of men in power, the influence of education. In a word, all temporal considerations of honor, profit, and pleasure are visibly on the Protestant side. Okay. English Catholics were no longer a threat. Irish Catholics were. Why not reform the penal laws, emancipate Catholics in order to kind of solidify the British nation? What seemed like a no-brainer, however, in the 1770s took about 50 years to finish. And the reason it took so long is that this issue of Catholicism's place in English identity and English history was so troubled. It elicited so many paradoxes and ended up being a live wire in a time when it seemed, or it was thought, that this type of religious division within England had been surpassed. Okay? What the book does is argue that there are, as a result, these paradoxes, contradictions, and tensions that are inherent to the sense of English understanding of its own national identity and its religious past, and that these reverberate within the literature of the Romantic period. And if you have a sense of what those paradoxes are, you will see them coming up in the literature, and you can also understand the ways that the literature was trying to intervene in culture to either resolve them or push on one side of the contradiction or the other. Okay? So, the paradoxes. And I'm pulling up a number of political cartoons from the period by James Gilray. So I'll run the paradox on one side, and we can see a picture that more or less embodies the paradox on the other. Okay? And this is the one we've been talking about. The Catholic question really comes to a head around the French Revolution, because the Irish Catholics were always somewhat dangerous. Give them revolutionary ideas, such as those that went violent in France, and it becomes really quite scary. Okay? So to stop Ireland going revolutionary, the thinking would be give Catholics full rights, emancipate Catholics, get rid of the penal laws. However, this was the counter-argument. If Catholics are given full rights, you lose the Protestant national character, and that Protestant national character is what protects Britain against such revolutionary influence in the first place. Okay? So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. Paradox 1, involving Ireland. And this is the cover of the book, and it's called The End of the Farce of Irish Emancipation. And it's showing these rowdy Catholic and Irish ragamuffins being blown away from the steps of heaven and off the globe by these forces of the English establishment in 1805. Okay, that's paradox number 1. The other paradox, paradox number 2, involves the Enlightenment and that sense of history marching forward, history progressing that I talked about before. If Britain wants to claim moral superiority over France and Spain and consider itself the most enlightened and progressive nation among contending nations, and thus giving themselves a kind of moral right to empire, they need to stop persecuting Catholics on religious grounds and give them full rights, i.e. it's not enlightened to persecute on the basis of religion, right? It's enlightened to be tolerant. However, if Catholics are admitted into Parliament and civil society, which was part of Catholic emancipation, the backwardness of Catholics will cause the nation to regress. Right? So it's enlightened to let Catholics in, right? But if you let Catholics in, because they're primitive and backward, they'll undermine that enlightenment. Right? Paradox number 2. And here we see those supporters, those political supporters of Catholic emancipation being driven out of England. Those are the cliffs of Dover, and driven into the English Channel towards France, back to France with you. And it's represented as John Bull taking the place of Christ, driving the pigs, the possessed pigs, away into the river. Okay, so again, it's this need to get rid of the primitive, the chaotic that's associated with Catholicism. Paradox number 3. And this, again, this is a slightly different paradox because it summons up what was more a conservative tendency that revolved around a certain nostalgia of what Catholicism could possibly represent, but that Catholicism became a corruption of. Okay? And it deals with not Enlightenment or the Irish, but an encounter with modernity. So if the British national culture in the 19th century is encountering industrialism, individualism, and revolutionary democracy, and that these threaten to undermine national character, many felt there was a need to kind of return to Britain's deep past, and that deep past in which there was a Catholic sense of community and sacramentality. All right? So this need for a return to Catholicism. However, if you go back and try to get those positive elements, community and sacramentality, you run the risk of letting actual Catholics return, and everyone knows that actual Catholics are superstitious, backwards, and tyrannical. All right? So you want this to improve your national character, but if you do that, you might let this in too. So in all these elements, the relationship with Ireland, the relationship with Enlightenment ideals, the encounter with modernity, there are these two forces pulling and pushing in different ways. And that British Romanticism and Catholic question ends up not being that integration that we saw in the opening slide, but this struggle elicited by these paradoxes. So the results. The first claim of the book is that if we understand the role of the Catholic question and Catholic emancipation as it played out within the Romantic period, we can see this tension of unresolved back and forth. And this tension of these ideological issues causes ambivalence and fracturing in the progressive spirit of the age. And we can see this, we can find it in the literature. But I don't want to paint the literary efforts as merely registering or reflecting something that's going on in the broader culture, but rather to see them as intervening and involved with the broader culture. Right? So it's just not passive, but they're players too. And in some ways, because we're talking about cultural issues, the politics is inflected with culture, they're important players. And what I often find a lot of the Romantic writers doing is not pushing a trajectory out of Protestantism, taking Protestantism the next step, but re-articulating a form of Anglicanism and an Anglican sense of culture. And that Anglican sense of culture is attempting to balance between revolutionary enthusiasm, so the individualism of a Blake, right, the energy of a Blake, and Catholic superstition, right, that community and sacramentality, and trying to find an acceptable balance or middle way, what was often called in theological and ecclesiological circles a via media between those two. This was a hard struggle a struggle that wasn't always successful, and one that was baffling, or it seemed to be baffling by those within the time period. This is my man, Leigh Hunt. Some of you may know him. He commented in 1808, in absolute bewilderment that they couldn't get this legislation passed, that they couldn't get the penal laws off the books against Catholics, and they couldn't pass Catholic emancipation. And he writes, "If posterity were to judge the present time by their general character, they would be somewhat amazed at our late rejection of the Catholic petition. The age is more generally refined than any preceding era in modern history, i.e. we're enlightened. Knowledge is everywhere diffused. Continental superstition," right, there's that superstition word again, "is daily decreasing, and men are more inclined to judge of each other not by what they think, but by what they do," i.e. the spirit of the age would seem to say, pass Catholic emancipation. It's taken so long to do it. And this is in 1808, and Catholic emancipation doesn't pass for another 2 decades, 1829, right? So those are the results, and I try to trace those out through the following chapters. The first is in Elizabeth Inchbald's novel, A Simple Story, which I argue is a form of a national tale, which was often written, which is a type of novel that tries to understand the relationship between England and Ireland, England and Scotland in terms of a marriage plot. So it translates what's going on at the political level into the personal level. And Inchbald is herself Catholic, and she favors Catholic emancipation. So I tried to pick representative works that capture the spirit and the inclination and the understanding of the various positions. So that's Inchbald. Percy Bysshe Shelley, and we could put Leigh Hunt in this camp too, was liberal in terms of his political and religious views. Not one who liked Catholicism per se, and would often, as Hunt did earlier, use the term superstition to describe Catholicism, but was nevertheless in favor of Catholic emancipation. And he would again be pushing that Enlightenment argument for toleration. And that plays out in gut-wrenching ways in Percy Bysshe Shelley's tragic drama, The Cenci, which I argue is in some ways illustrating and dramatizing the effects of the Irish struggles and the Irish pain in English culture. Moving on from there, and this will be the area of focus as we wrap up, and it'll be the third section, is to look at Wordsworth. Wordsworth, by the end of his life, had adopted conservative political opinions, and inclusive of that was a stark opposition to Catholic emancipation. And we'll talk more about why that occurs and look at an example from the Excursion. The book also looks at his poems, the ecclesiastical sonnets, which are just as exciting as they sound. And if you think that's, if you say, wow, that's exciting. The other thing I look at is essays on epitaphs. So epitaphs are gravestone writings. So it's all fun and laughter in that chapter. And so I'm giving you the happiest bit of that chapter when we look at the Excursion. And then the next chapter is looking at Walter Scott and Robin Hood. So his historical novel about medieval England called Ivanhoe. Scott represents a really important position. He was a conservative and initially opposed Catholic emancipation. Catholic emancipation would have never passed had not certain conservatives switched sides and supported it. So he's important as a hinge, as a pivot figure. And I think the grounds that allow him to make that movement are articulated in Ivanhoe, and that's what that chapter is arguing. And then finally, the conclusion is called England in 1829. which is the year that Catholic emancipation finally passes. And I look at writings of that period, and we'll look at a painting of that period to close out today, in which these paradoxes, these contradictions persist, right? And they persist and not only trouble England's relationship with religious history, but also end up troubling and providing difficult models for any time when there seems to be an encounter between an Englishman and somebody who is viewed as superstitious or primitive. So it ends up being a model that can apply not just to religion, but to issues such as race, ethnicity, other religions. And my argument there is that this sets an unfortunate precedent for how Britain forms not only its national identity, but its imperial identity. Okay? Okay. Wordsworth. Wordsworth and the School of Superstition is what we can title this. Wordsworth dates 1780, 1850. He was one of the few romantics who didn't die young, and that's unfortunate. Everyone loves young Wordsworth. He was a French revolutionary. He was enthusiastic. He got so excited about the French Revolution when he was in college, he kind of left college and went over to France and hung out with the revolutionaries. Had a mistress among the Revolutionary Party and even fathered a child with one. So he was really into it, right? However, because he was so close to it, he was also struck when it went violent and when it turned tyrannical, and he drew back, and he drew back far, right? And the later Romantics, Shelley, Leigh Hunt, Byron, Keats, they had trouble forgiving him for it, and looked upon this as an apostasy, as a treachery to the cause, to the revolutionary cause. So even though they shared an aesthetic understanding, there was this major division over politics between the early Romantics, Wordsworth, and the late Romantics, Shelley and company. So by 1814, this is what Wordsworth's saying politically. I very much prefer the course of their policy. This is the conservative government to that of the opposition, the reformers, the Whigs, whom Shelley and company supported, especially on 2 points most near my heart. Resistance of Bonaparte by force of arms, right? The French Revolution had kind of handed the baton to Bonaparte, who at this point is acting with imperial sway, and Wordsworth calling for Britain to kind of continue military action against him, and their adherence to the principles of the British Constitution in withholding political power from the Roman Catholics. So Wordsworth seeing something inherently English going into the British Constitution in denying political power to Roman Catholics and to supporting the penal laws. Right? So he's very much opposed to it, and he's pointing that out as one of the two major things in the age. Right? His turning away from the French Revolution going hand in hand with his opposition to Catholic emancipation. As I said, the French Revolution, if it's an answer on a multiple choice question, tick that box, right? And Wordsworth's own encounter with the French Revolution really dogged him. His most popular at the time and most important public poem that he wrote was an epic poem called The Excursion. No one reads this now, right? No one reads The Excursion now, but it was what people knew at the time. It was published in 1814. Wordsworth's Prelude, which is about his own childhood and his own process, his own autobiographical process of becoming a poet, wasn't published until 1850. So in his lifetime, nobody had access to it except a small circle. So I'm looking today at his most important public poem, in which he's trying to make a public statement about British culture. And this has worried Wordsworth, right? He's got a headache. He's trying to figure out, what do we do in the wake of the French Revolution? And what he's concerned about in The Excursion is what happens to those whose hopes for humanity were puffed up, were raised by the French Revolution, but then underwent a devastating disappointment afterwards. And this is a reflection of his own experience, such that they had no hope in going forward for humanity or society. Right? Worried Wordsworth. The Excursion tells this tale, and there are several figures in it, and they're all inflections of Wordsworth's own personality. And the one who undergoes this big disappointment is called the solitary. And the condition of the solitary is said to be despondency, a lack of hope after the French Revolution and anything good coming about. Now, the turning point, which is what I focus on in the book, where despondency is corrected, i.e., the solitary is cured, the effects of the French Revolution are cured, happen in Book 4. And it seems to be in what Wordsworth talks about here, in these lines. If unreligious, this figure called the wanderer, this kind of prophet vagabond, who again is like Wordsworth. If unreligious, let him be, at once, among 10,000 innocents, enrolled a pupil in the many-chambered school where superstition weaves her airy dreams. Right? So there is something positive about superstition that Wordsworth is recommending to this figure who has undergone this despondency and despair in his encounter with modernity. Let him go back. There's something superstition, a simpler life, has to teach us. What could that be? What could the school of superstition be? And is it Catholic superstition that we're going back to? Okay, so I've given you a handout here, and there's a lot of text on this screen. So I gave you the handout so that it would be easier to follow along. And I'm going to telescope quite a bit here. But the key moment seems to be when a superstitious, a kind of more primitive encounter with nature is enabled for the solitary, when the wanderer, this kind of prophet, this vagabond prophet, is able to kind of redirect his gaze towards nature so that he sees nature again in a sacramental way. Okay, I'll go ahead and read this. As the ample moon in the deep stillness of a summer even, rising behind a thick and lofty grove, burns like an unconsuming fire of light in the green trees, and, kindling on all sides their leafy umbrage, turns the dusky vale into a substance glorious as her own. Yea, with her own incorporated by power capacious and serene. Like power abides in man's celestial spirit. Virtue thus sets forth and magnifies herself, thus feeds a calm, a beautiful, and silent fire. From the encumbrances of mortal life, from error, disappointment, nay, from guilt, and sometimes so relenting justice wills, from palpable oppressions of despair. Right? Palpable oppressions of despair. That's where the solitary started. That's where the failed French Revolutionary was left. But Wordsworth arguing that this moment is somehow enough to get one out of that despair, to save, right? To save from error and disappointment, relenting, softening justice wills, mercy wills, a way out of this despair. And it comes in this moment. But it's this encounter with nature, and this is the thing with Wordsworth. It often seems like the language is so plain, but there's something beneath the surface that is calling up something bigger. Burns like an unconsuming fire of light. On the one hand, he's just talking about a sunset, right? This moment of dusk and a kind of bright light emanating over the hills. But the way he describes it, an unconsuming fire of light, is hearkening back to Genesis, right? This encounter with the burning bush, a fire that does not burn. Unconsuming fire of light in the green trees. Right? So it's like that. It's like seeing in nature the presence of God revealed, just as Moses did. And what is this? What is this happening, right? It's turning the dusky veil into a substance glorious as her own. Right? It's quite literally a transubstantiation, a changing of substance. Again, recalling, even using the kind of scholastic terminology, subtly, but calling it up, that is meant to describe a kind of Catholic sense of sacramentality as it approaches nature. And it is cooperative. It's both given, it's both graced from above, and also a function of man's celestial spirit. Right? It's a cooperative act, the making of this sacrament. So it seems like to get us out of the French Revolution, we need to return to something that very much resembles a Catholic understanding of nature. And if you think I'm making this up, right, there's a counter-argument in the book in which he says, you're starting to sound a lot like a Catholic, right? And the solitary shoots back at the Wanderer, who's Scottish. The Wanderer is Scottish, and he says, how think you, would they tolerate this scheme of fine propensities in Scotland, in Edinburgh, right? Where the Presbyterian Reformation was more radical than it was in England. What would they think about this in Edinburgh? That tends, if urged, far as it might be urged, to sow afresh the weeds of Romish fantasy, in vain uprooted, would reconsecrate our wells to good St. Filian and to fair St. Anne, and from long banishment recall St. Giles, to watch again with tutelary love o'er stately Edinburgh throned on crags, a blessed restoration to behold. Right, and that's sarcastic. A blessed restoration to behold. The patron on the shoulders of his priest, once more parading through her crowded streets, now simply guarded by the sober powers of science and philosophy and sense. This is not modern, this is not enlightened, the direction you're going. Right? It's to try and rebuild those ruins that we saw in the first slide. That's what you're proposing here, Wordsworth. You're returning and you think it's going to be okay, but actually what you're doing is letting them back in and turning back the clock. Now, the Wanderer has an answer for this. It's not a very good answer, but it's an answer I think Wordsworth's trying to come up with all his life and re-articulate all his life. Trying to separate this, the calm, the beautiful, the silent fire, that sense of balance, that sense of the via media, not running to extremes, a peaceful resolution of these two extremes, and trying to protect that return to this Catholic sense from this accusation that it is actually Catholic and thus disruptive, primitive, simplistic in a way that the solitary answers. And he has a hard time doing it. And I argue in the book that he never actually succeeds. In 1829, he's still writing about the troubles in Ireland and the way Irish ballads can take a perfectly beautiful rustic Irish scene and cause it to erupt into violence. Right? And that eruption of violence, I think, characterizes not only Wordsworth's project, but the ways in which the Catholic question inflected English culture. This is in a painting by Turner in 1829. It's a little hard to see. You know, it doesn't have the full up here. It doesn't have the full scope of Turner's painting. It's a huge painting, but he hurriedly painted this in 1829 in reaction to Catholic emancipation finally passing, partially. And it is Ulysses. This is Ulysses on his boat, escaping the Isle of the Cyclops. And allegorically, the Isle of the Cyclops was often associated with Ireland because it seemed like this island where you didn't know what to expect, and my gosh, they might just eat you. But Ireland was resolved and feared as a kind of cyclopean monster. So Ulysses here escaping the island, right? And it seems like a big celebration of that moment, right? Sun's rising, it's kind of symbol of enlightenment. The ship's heading away out of the frame, sailing off, to build an empire. If we put this back into an English context, the celebration of the ships that made the British Empire great. But, and there's a but here, right? And if you know the story, right? Ulysses, there he is, turns around and mocks the Cyclops. And whether it's in Ireland or whether it's in the epic by Homer, this doesn't end well for Ulysses, right? The Cyclops gets a big rock and he chucks it. And he chucks it at the boat, right? So this moment of triumph, of enlightenment, of sailing away from the chaos, from progressing past the primitive, because of the ridicule, because of the cultural mockery, ends up precipitating further violence, and further violence that causes Ulysses' own ship to shatter. Right? And the argument of the book is that this is an important element, this is an important episode in English history, but it's also important because it's going to form the mentality of those who set out on those ships. And some of these assumptions about religion and how to handle religion are still with us today. So I thank you for your time, for your patience. As I said before, if you want to read more, discover more, and get some of the nuances, you can. And we have a copy in the library if your budget doesn't allow for the purchase. So thank you once again, and I'm happy to take any questions if you did want to ask any questions. Did we have time for questions and answers, Jeff? Is that all right? Okay. I don't want to.
Do we know what numbers are with Catholics during this period? I mean, do they stay fairly constant? And then what happens in 1829?
Right.
Do the numbers go up?
Well, they do. In Ireland, the situation is there's an overwhelming majority of Catholics in Ireland. There is a remnant in England, and I have the numbers in the book. I'm not a numbers guy, so they're not ready to hand. But there's not much population at the beginning of, say, the 18th century. It gradually increases, and then with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, drastically increases. And a lot of those is a result of Irish immigration. So the English Catholic community is expanding, not exponentially, but it's expanding. There's a large influx, especially in the northern cities, the industrial cities, Manchester, the Durham area, around the coal fields, where you get an influx of Irish Catholics. And one of the results, or one of the things that happens is industrial unrest gets caught up with the Catholic question too. So the radical movement and the Catholic emancipation movement merge. And the issues, it's been argued that there's like a threefold concern. There's reform, there's repeal and emancipation. Reform of Parliament, which is the radical movement. Repeal of the Test and Corporation Acts, which affected non-Anglican Protestants, and then emancipation, so Catholic emancipation. So those, which I suppose you call those sociological factors, are all increasing. And then what happens after 1829 and into the Victorian era is that you have an increase in the number of conversions from Anglicanism to Catholicism, which reaches a head in the 1840s, 1850s, and what's often called Second Spring Catholicism, and associated with John Henry Newman. So this awoke all those anxieties about the past, and then immigration and conversion put them to the forefront in Victorian England. And as a result, there ends up being a fair amount of consideration of the role of Catholicism in Victorian England in the later half of the century. But not many people have looked at that earlier period, which I think is really quite important and quite formative for not only that it's being thought about, but how it's establishing the parameters of how it's going to be conceived later in the Victorian period. Thanks, Earl. Yeah, Kevin.
I wonder if you could give us a sort of sense. I mean, you talk about the sort of contradictions, and I imagine that has to be particularly sharp for English Catholics who might not want to be grouped with the Irish in this way.
Yes, yeah,
And yet, you know, still don't feel quite fully English insofar as they can.
Yeah. It's a great question. I didn't want to get into it because it's quite a nuanced question. And I actually just came out with another book called Firmly I Believe in Truly, which is available from Oxford University Press. If I can do another plug for myself, in the spirit of poo, I suppose, which kind of goes into tracing this nuance more. So one of the things I try to do is look at some of the insights that post-colonial theory has given us into how a marginalized community reacts to oppression. And in English Catholicism, it's not a happy time to be an English Catholic because the community is pulling itself in two different directions. On the one hand, you have what were called in the period Cisalpine Catholics, and are now often referred to as part of the English Catholic Enlightenment. And they did everything to align themselves for political reasons, but also kind of for heartfelt intellectual reasons, with enlightened maneuvers and enlightened movements of thought that actually often had quite a negative view of Catholicism. So you'll hear a lot of English Catholics articulating this very negative view of Catholicism, and part of it is to hope to allay the mainstream's fears about who Catholics were. And on the other hand, you had a camp associated and led by the most forceful bishop of the time, John Milner, who was arguing the opposite, that if we want to establish our place in society, we have to not dissolve into society, but assert our rights and maintain our identity. And Milner became associated with the Irish and actually represented the Irish bishops in negotiations with the British government. So you had these two camps, and they hated each other as much as they hated the English, if not more so. So some of these contradictions are even felt within. But it's a quite nuanced story. It shows up a little bit in Inchbald, but it's among figures that aren't kind of part of the mainstream of British Romanticism. Yeah, Paul.
Do the tensions that surround the Catholic question in England, I guess I'm curious if they play out also in the practices of the Anglican Church.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they certainly get caught up in it, and much of Anglicanism is. I mean, my argument is that some of the tensions that we find in British Romanticism are literary versions of the tensions that we find within the Anglican Church. And there are movements within Anglicanism to, again, go back, right, against what we're seeing as secularizing forces, to go back and reclaim liturgy, reclaim past history, reclaim saints from a medieval period, and root and ground ourselves in that. But at the same time, distinguishing from what would be called papacy, right? So it's an attempt, you have within the Anglican Church, one branch of the Anglican Church, attempt to craft a Catholic church that is not a papist church. And that's usually the way the distinction is parsed. And, you know, going alongside that, you have the Blakes, the radical Protestants who also could identify with the Anglican Church, although the relationship was tense on that end of the ideological spectrum as well. So yeah, it's very much interwoven with Anglican history, and that becomes more pronounced and more prominent, especially that Anglo-Catholic move later in the 19th century. Yeah, after 1829, actually. Great. Well, I appreciate all your attention. I thank you for the good questions and the conversation, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much.